Okay, I think everybody has started. So um, when I first signed up to do this session, I thought, oh, this is going to be easy because I did a paper on this topic at a Catholic worker or Dorothy Day conference back in 2015, and I figured out they've both been dead for decades. So what could have changed? And then, as Mary knows, a couple weeks ago, I went to a Catholic worker wedding in Portland, Oregon, and afterwards wandered into Powell's bookstore, which is one of the great bookstores in America, and found, much to my surprise, that 2 years worth of lectures that Jacques Derrida did on hospitality back in 96 and 97 had just been translated into English. And so I bought 2 volumes, 500 page, and I've been busily reading 500 pages of Derrida in the last 2 weeks. I'm not sure I've succeeded in incorporating, well, certainly not all of that into this talk, but a little bit. Um, and well, I got to say, given that is anybody familiar with Jacques Derrida? I mean, I'm not sure that there's some pages that translating into English didn't do me a whole lot of good. I would have misunderstood them just as well in French. But anyway, I'm going to assume most of you are more familiar with Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker than you are with Jacques Derrida. So I'll kind of use Derrida's thought as a framework and try to show how Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker might reflect on his thought, improve his thought, but also maybe be informed by his thought. Um, and, feel free to ask questions at any point. I guess it would seem difficult to find two stranger bedfellows than Dorothy Day and Jacques Derrida. Dorothy, as you know, was born in 1897 into a family of journalists, has been recommended for sainthood, and has kind of begun that process as having been declared a servant of God, founder of the Catholic worker movement, political activist, and a woman who spent half a century living among and providing hospitality to poor and homeless persons. Um, she's written numerous pieces. In fact, I guess one rumor that of why it's taken so long uh, for the canonization process is that she wrote so much that they have to read every word of it, which is taking apparently years. Um, but her most famous literary work was her uh, autobiography, The Long Loneliness, and she died in 1980. Jacques Derrida was born in 1930 in Algeria, a French Jew, a philosopher and literary critic, and the founder of deconstructionism. And if I can say one thing, I said feel free to ask questions, but please don't anybody ask me what deconstructionism is. Can I have a little promise on that? Because I don't know. I can't understand it. Um, anyway, he was best known for pretty complex philosophical tomes like Of Grammatology and Language Indifference, and he died in 2004. Their writing styles were a study in contrast. Day was the quintessential journalist, teller of stories, rarely writing systematically um, or being concerned with abstractions, frequently drawing on stories of her own experience, sayings of the Catholic saints. Derrida seemed to delight in incomprehensibility, coining neologisms and phrases, stringing words together to the point where I should warn you that when I quote him, there will almost always be ellipses in it because his sentences are about twice as long as they need to be to make sense, it seems. So I cut out a lot, which you could see if you were reading it, but uh, since you're not, you can't quite see that. Um, and with Derrida, we did some reading uh, oh, about 15 years ago with some of the other faculty at Nazareth, and of what Derrida said about hospitality, and one of them said, "Geez, I'm understanding this stuff, which really worries me because you're not supposed to understand Derrida." Um, the other Another big difference there is his examples were often drawn from fiction, from some of the classics, and rarely from his own experiences. Their religious approaches differed even more sharply. Day, of course, was a devout Catholic who challenged the church but remained faithful to it. Derrida was born Jewish, but would probably call himself an atheist. And many of his works either ignored Judaism or touched on it only lightly, although there has been a fairly recent book which argues that Judaism was much more influential in his thought than most of his followers believe. Um, they drew heavily, they drew on almost entirely different literary sources for their ideas on hospitality. Day drew, I would say, mostly on the Bible, Catholic social teaching, Emmanuel Mounier, Peter Morin, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and the writings of the saints. Derrida drew primarily on Immanuel Kant and Emmanuel Levinas, but also on less well-known figures like Emil Benaviste, Pierre Klosowski, well, Sophocles, Oedipus at Colonus is not exactly unknown, and Louis Massignon. Um, Perhaps more importantly, I'd say Day's examples of hospitality came from actual experiences, while Derrida's often came from works of fiction. And yet they had much in common, centering, I think, on their concern for hospitality. For Day, of course, hospitality was her life's work, a half century of sharing her home with the homeless residents of the Lower East Side of New York City and shepherding a nationwide movement of houses of hospitality. For Derrida, the concern for hospitality came later in life, mostly during the mid to late 1990s, some 15 years after Dorothy's death. His approach to hospitality differed from Dorothy's in a couple of ways. First, that it was much more philosophical, abstract, and conceptual. And second, that um, he tended to focus more on the national and political level of hospitality. A lot of his concrete examples and a lot of the things he tried to address were problems that France was uh, having with immigration in the 1990s, and this was when the National Front was getting started, kind of that the very right wing anti-immigration movement, and so some of his writings actually have a lot of relevance for America today, I would say, on that issue. He didn't embody hospitality in his personal life, though, to the extent that Dorothy did, although he did state that he put asylum seekers up when necessary. And he signed a public statement in, I think, 96, asserting that he and others had provided hospitality to Algerian refugees in defiance of the Debray laws, which were very anti-hospitality, uh, an act which he termed civil disobedience. I will argue that Dorothy, along with the Catholic worker movement, which she founded, represents one of the most determined efforts to engage in what Derrida termed the impossibility of pure or unconditional hospitality. That Derrida's thought about hospitality provides a useful framework for empowering contemporary workers to reflect on their own practices of hospitality, and that the worker experience leads to a deeper understanding and perhaps critique of Derrida's insights on hospitality. Derrida began to address hospitality publicly in late 1995, apparently in response to two events. The first was the death of Emmanuel Levinas in 1995, and the second, the rising debate over immigration in France, coupled with the passage of fairly draconian anti-hospitality legislation. In November of 95, he began a series of lectures on hospitality that would run until May 1997. Those are the ones I've just read. Derrida spoke at Levinas's funeral and a year later gave a talk at a symposium in his honor. Levinas was an existentialist philosopher greatly influenced by Husserl and Heidegger, who used the image of the face to represent the humanity of the other. In Derrida's talk, he argued that hospitality was a major, if not the major theme of Levinas's work, noting of Levinas's masterwork, although the word is neither frequently used nor emphasized within it, Totality and Infinity bequeaths to us an immense treatise of hospitality. Also in 1996, he was asked to address the International Parliament of Writers in Strasbourg, which was in the process of trying to set up what they were calling cities of refuge for writers who were suffering persecution. And Derrida joined that effort. The head of this international parliament was Salman Rushdie. And one of the things after the fatwa had been issued against him, and one of the things that Derrida noted was in some ways it was a disadvantage to have Rushdie as the head because so many of the people who really needed help were, quote, nameless, unknown, not celebrities. So what is hospitality for Derrida and for Day? For Derrida, hospitality encompasses almost everything. To use Levinas's terms, it's an infinity rather than a totality. Derrida argued that hospitality is not a concept that lends itself to objective knowledge. Hospitality is an experience. And yet he often equates hospitality with ethics. For hospitality is not simply some region of ethics, it is the principles of ethics. And even with culture itself, there is no culture that is not also a culture of hospitality. Hospitality is culture itself. He associates hospitality often in complex ways with things like forgiveness, with language, with ipseity, which means basically a sense of selfhood, with allergy, with power, with war, with xenophobia, and even with death, which he comes back to repeatedly. He also associates hospitality with hostility, even coining the neologism hospitality, reminiscent perhaps of the old Catholic worker joke about having houses of hostility, that somehow the two go together. He even questions whether love should play a role in hospitality, which I don't think Dorothy would agree with. But at its most basic level, he equates hospitality with intentionality, a move that can only be understood in context of the phenomenological meaning of intentionality. The word intentional is a key here. Derrida's early work was a response to Edmund Husserl, who defined intentionality as the orientation of consciousness toward an object. For Husserl, there was no consciousness. We have no consciousness except consciousness of something, of an object. Hence, consciousness is always intentional. It's always intended towards some object. And so one cannot be conscious except as conscious of an other. And thus consciousness itself is hospitality, kind of a welcoming of the other into myself, even including the welcoming of ideas into myself. Derrida also quotes Levinas to the effect that hospitality is the criterion for being human. To shelter the other in one's own land or home, is that the criterion of humanness? Unquestionably so. One notion that Derrida contrasts with hospitality is tolerance. In an interview in New York City conducted shortly after the September 11th attacks, he stated, "Tolerance is actually the opposite of hospitality, or at least its limit. If I think I am being hospitable because I am tolerant, it is because I wish to limit my welcome to retain power and maintain control over the limits of my home, my sovereignty. He did, in that same interview, soften his critique by saying tolerance is a conditional, circumspect, cautious hospitality. Derrida also raises the question of whether hospitality should be extended only to humans, raising the possibility that it should also be offered to animals, to plants, to gods, and even to the dead. He talks a lot about hospitality to ghosts, which I'm sorry, I'm not going to cover that. He cites Noah's Ark as an example of hospitality to animals and even raises the question of hospitality towards viruses. Um, I'm reminded of the first time I visited St. Joseph's House in New York City with a friend, when my friend tried to step on a particularly large and loathsome looking cockroach. A young woman ran up to him and said, "No, don't hurt them. They don't eat much." Um, so I guess the worker does do some hospitality towards animals as well. Although Day's writings were not so philosophical or abstract as Derrida's, she also elevated hospitality to a place of ultimate concern. In an early unsigned article in the Catholic Worker paper, the author, who was almost certainly Dorothy, states, "Hospitality is the keynote of civilization. Its opposite is greed." And now I'm going to talk about hospitality as aporia, which I'll define for you in just a minute. Um, Derrida treats hospitality as an aporia, an impossibility, a contradiction in terms. Hospitality is a self-contradictory concept and experience which can only self-destruct. In saying this, he wasn't condemning hospitality, but rather elevating it. For Derrida, all ethically, humanly important notions are aporia. Derrida's list of aporia includes hospitality, justice, the gift, responsibility, democracy, and forgiveness. One commentary on Derrida notes that aporia is a Greek term that literally means no way out or impasse. For Derrida, the aporia is essentially connected with the moment of decision. The decision is always essentially, fundamentally undecidable. We characterize a moment as a moment of decision precisely because while there may seem to be, as we say, pros and cons that pull us into opposing directions, there is on either side of the decision nothing definitive that would delineate a path for us. Derrida explains his use of aporia in ethical terms. How to justify the choice of a negative form, aporia, to designate a duty that, through the impossible or the impractical, nevertheless announces itself in an affirmative fashion, because one must avoid good conscience at all cost. Good conscience is incompatible with the absolute risk that every promise, every engagement, and every responsible decision must run. In short, one can never act in good conscience. One can never feel justified because one has followed the rules in a Kantian sense. A passage which clarifies this comes from Derrida's discussion of forgiveness as aporia, where he basically says, you can only forgive the unforgivable. And yet, if you've forgiven something, then it's forgivable. But if you, but if it's, but if you don't try to forgive something, then, and so forgiveness becomes an impossibility, something you can never feel like, oh, I've done that, aren't I grand? Thus, anytime I do forgive, what is forgiven must be the forgivable. Yet the concept of forgiveness really applies to what is unforgivable. There are then no empirical examples of pure forgiveness, and similarly none of pure hospitality. Applying the notion of aporia to hospitality, Derrida says, I am not claiming that hospitality is this double bind or this aporetic contradiction, and that therefore, whatever hospitality is, there is no hospitality. No, I am saying that this apparently aporetic paralysis must be overcome. It is necessary to do the impossible. If there is hospitality, the impossible must be done. So one might say that hospitality is an aporia in two senses. First, there is the aporia between unconditional and conditional hospitality, where absolute or unconditional hospitality can't be achieved, but conditional hospitality is not really hospitality. Yet, absolute hospitality can be achieved only in the form of conditional hospitality. And secondly, absolute or unconditional hospitality itself is an aporia. And this takes maybe a little bit of thinking, but I think it really does fit in with Catholic worker notions of hospitality, as I'll get into. I'm going to start with unconditional versus conditional hospitality, um, where I think Derrida's most crucial move is to distinguish between what he calls unconditional, or sometimes he calls it pure or absolute or infinite hospitality, and conditional hospitality. Unconditional hospitality, he often called the law of hospitality, like with a capital L. Um, while conditional hospitality was termed the laws of hospitality or the hospitality of rights. One thing he never explains is where he got this absolute law of hospitality. Um, but let's go with that for the moment. So he says unconditional hospitality is it that you don't ask the other, the newcomer, the guest, to give anything back or even to identify himself or herself. Even if the other deprives you of your mastery of your home, you have to accept this. It is terrible to accept this, but that is the condition of unconditional hospitality, that you give up the mastery of your space, your home, your nation. It is unbearable. If, however, there is pure hospitality, it should be pushed to this extreme. This unconditional hospitality must be not only disarmed, but carefree, careless of its own enrichment. It must not make any difference or example between welcoming a poor and a rich person. Whether rich or poor, poor in money or in culture, just anybody, or a Nobel Prize winner, it must come down to the same. I must not even know who they are to begin with. I don't want either to reproduce a stereotype as a stereotype the idea or ethics of bareness, Franciscan asceticism, Christ-like poverty, etc. Although there must be something like that in hospitality, that's almost as close as he gets to giving a nod to Christianity, if you will. This aporia is indeed an antinomy in the strict sense of the term because it does not oppose a law to nature or to empirical facts, but opposes two laws, and there is a hierarchy. The law of unconditional hospitality is above the laws. Now, Derrida admits that unconditional hospitality can only be approximated in real life by some form of conditional hospitality. If one moves right away to unconditional hospitality, it can be just anything at all. There is no longer even any identifiable host. So it is necessary to have limits. It is why between unconditional hospitality and conditional hospitality, there is no simple opposition. There is a strange implication of the one in the other. Conditional hospitality deserves the name of hospitality only to the extent that it lets itself be oriented, guided by an idea or an ideal of absolute hospitality. Derrida also distinguishes between the hospitality of invitation and the hospitality of visitation, where the hospitality of invitation is always conditional, but the hospitality of visitation, where somebody just drops in without an invite, can be either unconditional or conditional. If I am unconditionally hospitable, I must welcome the visitation, not the invited guest, but the visitor. I must be unprepared or prepared to be unprepared for the unexpected arrival of any other. However, not all hospitality of visitation is pure hospitality, for other conditions can be imposed, conditions of citizenship, of gender, of obeying the rules, etc. In House of Hospitality, Dorothy Day affirmed a vision of unconditional hospitality similar to that of Derrida's. So we take whoever comes to us as sent by God and do not believe in picking and choosing. If we start eliminating, there is no end to it. In her writings and in her life, Dorothy tried to emulate absolute hospitality decades before Derrida formulated the notion. In an early defense of the Catholic worker practice of hospitality, she justified welcoming all, deserving or undeserving. Many times we have borne the charge that houses of hospitality do more harm than good. It is said that they perpetuate chronic laziness and drunkenness. Communists ask us, how can you say you're against capitalism when you keep it alive by feeding the poor the crumbs of the rich? We are told to discriminate on the side of the deserving poor. There is no record in the history of hospices and hospitality of discrimination. Those who disapprove of feeding the burdens of society might look to the work of the nuns and priests laboring among the lepers. Christ exercises good works among those who today would be lumped with the chronics. Hospitable in his heart, he took in the sinning woman and the thief beside him on the cross. Excuse me one sec. Any questions first? Or am I totally boring people, or is this going okay? Okay. Dorothy justified pure hospitality by seeing the divine, Christ, in the guest. It is no use to say that we are born 2,000 years too late to give room to Christ, nor will those who live at the end of the world have been born too late. Christ is always with us, always asking for room in our hearts. But now it is with the voice of our contemporaries that he speaks. It is with the feet of soldiers and tramps that he walks, and with the heart of anyone in need that he longs for shelter, and giving shelter or food to anyone who asks for it or needs it is giving it to Christ. Derrida did not invoke Christ to justify hospitality. However, several times he invoked his own Jewish tradition, calling the guest the Messiah. He awaits without knowing whom he awaits. He waits for the Messiah. He waits for anyone who might come. Sometimes even the guest can claim the status of Christ or Messiah. Um, for over 30 years, I ran the Saturday meal at St. Joseph's House in Rochester. And in the old days, I used to try to arrive early before any of the guests to get a few minutes of peace before the day began. That's when I had young sons, and that half hour at St. Joe's was precious to me because it was my only time of relative peace. One Saturday, someone I had known for a few years was waiting, and I let him in early. Um, I regretted the decision the whole day. I didn't realize how high he was, and he was just a pain the entire day. Just going up to the line where I would ask him to leave, but not never crossing over it. So it was just a miserable day. And so the next week, I get there very early, and there's another guy who I don't know waiting at the door. And so I drive around the block, hoping he'll go away. Still there, so I drive around the block another time. Still there, so I and get out of the car and I say, "Hi, my name's Harry. What's yours?" And he says, "Jesus." What more can one say? Dorothy Day experienced the aporia of unconditional versus conditional hospitality in very concrete ways, as illustrated by two diary entries from 1950. Then at 1 a.m., a man and woman came bringing a drunken woman in, and I was very harsh in not taking her in. As Tom said, before dawn came, I had denied our Lord in her. I felt very guilty, more for my manner than for doing it, as we could not have all the other women in the house disturbed. Uh, the second entry was recorded during a retreat being held at the worker. Just now, a knock at the door came, and a young man wanted to spend the night. I told him to go eat, but that we could not put him up. Always this impulse to say no, yet each such encounter as an opportunity to see Christ in the other, our brother. So I left the conference and told him to stay. All the kindness we might do, but don't. Um, I really love Dorothy's diaries. As as we're collected in The Duty of Delight, because much more than her regular published writings, that's where you get into how she dealt with hospitality as an aporia, how it didn't all go, that's where you really see how it didn't go all nicely and smoothly for Dorothy, but she wrestled with these issues, which made me feel so much better than the passages in the Long Loneliness where it all seemed kind of easy. Um, Father Richard McSorley, who is associated with the Catholic Worker in Washington, D.C., I think expressed this aporia really well. It's almost an inbuilt conflict in the Catholic Worker about how many guests you take into a house. One theory is that when a stranger comes to the door, it's Christ and you let him in. And the other theory is that if you're going to let Christ in, you don't want to have Christ sleep under the sink, and you don't want Christ to crowd out all the other Christs that are already in there. Sometimes this conflict breaks Catholic worker communities apart. In the late 1970s, I spent 2 years at Unity Kitchen in Syracuse, New York. When I arrived in 1977, the kitchen was pretty close to the pole of unconditional hospitality. We served 2 meals a day to anyone who came and provided shelter, although usually only to men from 8 p.m. to 7 a.m. every evening. Um, there were 34 beds, but when the beds were full, which was practically every night, men slept on chairs. When the chairs were full, they slept in the spaces between the beds. And there were many nights when not only the beds and the chairs, but every space between the beds was full. Um, we had two rules: no fighting and no drinking, and we did bar people for breaking those rules. We even had one man who was barred for life or until the second coming of Jesus, whichever came last. Um, but there was no restriction on coming in drunk or high. And if someone brought in a bottle of wine or beer, we put it in the refrigerator and gave it to them the next morning. Uh, Conditions were, however, primitive. Um, One guest, when someone suggested that he should be grateful for our help, screamed back, "Grateful? You should pay me to come into this dump," which had a lot of truth to it. Bob Tavani, a longtime Catholic worker who visited us while I was there, recounted to Rosalie Riegel, "I remember Dorothy talking to these people in Syracuse when they were giving unlimited hospitality. They were young people who were overgenerous, who didn't know how to set boundaries and got themselves exhausted. The place was just a wreck, like a city shelter. Dorothy said, 'Do your share and do it well, and then agitate the rest of the community to do their share.'" Dorothy didn't visit during my 2 year tenure, and I never heard any story about her having told us that, although she did speak generally about the need to be small and personalist in contrast to her statements about being open to anyone. In any event, some within the community pressured for more limited hospitality, saying to grow smaller to serve the hidden Christ. Henry Nicolella, who for me was the embodiment of unconditional hospitality, left Unity Kitchen in 1978 to go to the Chicago Worker, St. Francis House. And although Ron and I pressed to continue unlimited hospitality for another year, the shelter was closed after Ron injured his back, moving a refrigerator up 2 flights of stairs for some of our guests, only to discover that they already had a perfectly working refrigerator already in the apartment. But that put us at too many people down, and we ended up closing the shelter, and just people were just out in the streets. Restrictions on the meal soon followed, and Ron and I left the kitchen. Um, Not long after, the kitchen became a community that served a meal to 24 hand-picked invited guests twice a week. In Derrida's term, the kitchen had gone from a hospitality of visitation to one of invitation. This aporia of hospitality is especially revealed at the door. Derrida says, for there to be hospitality, there must be a door. But if there is a door, there is no longer hospitality. There is no hospitable house. There is no house without doors and windows. But as soon as there are a door and windows, it means that someone has the key to them and consequently controls the conditions of hospitality. There must be a threshold, but if there is a threshold, there is no longer hospitality. This is the difference between the hospitality of invitation and the hospitality of visitation. In visitation, there is no door. Anyone can come at any time and can come in without needing a key for the door. Examples of the aporia of the door, I think, abound in the Catholic worker. At Unity Kitchen, there was a former mental patient who was one of what we called our auxiliary staff, who lived in the house and did a lot of the cleanup work. The kitchen then, as I said, served 2 meals a day and was open from 8 p.m. to 7 a.m. We told this worker, Mike, that he had to resign as auxiliary staff one day after he let a very dangerous guest known as the captain into the building when the house was closed and no, quote, real workers were present. Another auxiliary staff person wrestled the captain out of the building, ripping the front door off its hinges in the process. And so for about 24 hours, until Ron fixed it, we were without a door, existing very uncomfortably in a state of pure hospitality, unable to close the door on anyone. We decided that Mike was too unpredictable to stay in the house when we weren't there and asked him to leave and return as a normal guest. In talking with Mike, though, it became obvious that he was consciously enacting pure hospitality. He firmly believed that the kitchen was for everyone and that anyone, anytime should be let in the door. But Mike's hospitality was too pure for our Catholic worker house. Another door example was the Missouri Catholic worker, Lana Jacobs, once told me that she also did a lot of civil disobedience. And she said, doing civil disobedience is important for hospitality because you never know if the person at the door is going to be your cellmate someday. And that makes you a lot more hospitable. Catholic worker hospitality, I would say, does come closer to Derrida's pure hospitality than do many, I'd say most social service agents, which often treat hospitality as an ancillary service, an appendix to their real work of conversion or therapy. Rescue missions make hospitality conditional on attending a religious service, or for shelter, taking a nosedive, as the homeless folks called it, and confessing that Jesus is your Lord and Savior. Residential drug and alcohol treatment agencies make hospitality conditional on sticking with the program. Battered women's shelters make hospitality conditional on establishing oneself as a battered woman. Many homeless shelters make hospitality conditional on producing a social security number to prove that you exist, or or receiving permission from the welfare department, and on and on. Okay, so that's conditional versus unconditional hospitality. I want to talk also about unconditional hospitality as aporia. Absolute hospitality itself is an aporia. If the host receives the guest into his or her home unconditionally without reservation, then the host is no longer master of the house and cannot therefore give hospitality. This is a basic truth that none of us are really the master of our house. We're all guests on this planet, and as Derrida would say, we're guests in our own home. In pure hospitality, then, the host must risk his or her own identity as a host. Derrida applied this notion to the dilemma of immigration, arguing that France must welcome immigrants hospitably, even at the risk of losing its national identity. Catholic worker communities have taken this risk as well. Two examples of pure hospitality to the point of losing sovereignty come from central Massachusetts. One was the House of Ammon, which was started in 1971 in the town of Hubbardston by Father Bernie Gilgun. Prior to starting the house, Bernie wrote to Dorothy Day, "As you know, several of us have been talking, more dreaming about a Catholic worker house here that it would accept absolutely the whole platform without any hedging. Naturally, the house of hospitality will be just that. The sky and the cops will be the limit." A 1972 letter stated, "Both the deserving and the undeserving poor are received as Christ. Thank God we don't have the problem of the social workers trying to decide which are which. All are welcome here." I never saw the house uh, since it had burned to the ground a few years before I went to the mustard seed in nearby Worcester. However, the House of Ammon was a frequent topic of conversation at the seed. At one discussion, the founder reminisced, "At the mustard seed, it's always been someone being asked to leave, meetings, someone forced out. It was never like that at Hubbardston. No one was ever turned away. The doors were open 24 hours a day. They just arrived, and if they liked it, they stayed." A former worker at the house interjected, "Yeah, if they didn't get the shit kicked out of them." One worker recalled, "We never had locks on our doors until the motorcycle gang moved in. Then they put locks on their doors." Another recalled, "What we didn't realize at first was that someone was making the rules. It just wasn't us. People would get thrown out of the house by the strongest people there. We just moved the streets inside. It took me 10 years to realize that." Father Gilgun recalled of the fire which destroyed the house, in which one young guest lost his life. "Dorothy so often says our faith and love has been tried by fire. Ours was tried by fire in more ways than you can imagine. We were burnt out and something had to give. And then there was this dramatic sign from God that our work was over and that we would be able to go on with the same work, but more relaxed, not so radical in the no rules." The other example was the mustard seed itself, where I lived one summer in the early 1980s, prior to the fire which destroyed that building as well. I arrived just after a bitter struggle in which the College Joes, the ideologically committed Catholic workers who had founded the house, had been forced out, and the seed was being run by a group of folks who had originally come to the house as homeless guests. In many ways, it was a perfect example of Derrida's unconditional absolute hospitality. The guests had actually replaced the hosts, um, but with some problems. It became apparent, even to me eventually, that certain aspects of Catholic worker were no longer being adhered to, uh, particularly the principle of strict nonviolence. For Derrida, an important but largely unresolved issue concerns whether a host should ask for a guest's name, which approach is pure hospitality. Does hospitality consist in interrogating the new arrival? Does it begin with a question addressed to the newcomer, which seems very human and sometimes loving, "What is your name?" Or does hospitality begin with the unquestioning welcome in a double effacement, the effacement of the question and the name? Is it more just and more loving to question or not to question? To call by the name or without the name? Does one give hospitality to a subject identifiable by name, or is hospitality rendered? Is it given to the other before they are identified? At one point, he states that this dilemma has a possible resolution for a change. Um, Pure hospitality consists in welcoming the new arrival before imposing conditions on them, before knowing and asking for anything at all, be it a name or an identity paper, but it also assumes that you address them individually and thus that you call them something and grant them a proper name. What are you called? Hospitality consists in doing everything possible to address the other, to grant and ask them their name, while avoiding this question becoming a condition, a police inquisition, a registration of information. Perhaps the most extreme example of hospitality with identification was the case of Louis, who lived first at Unity Kitchen and later at the staff house of those workers from the late 1970s until his death nearly 40 years later. When he died, what several people had suspected was confirmed, that Louis was not his real name, and his last name he gave us was also not his real last name. And it took considerable effort to finally locate a name and a family for his burial. Finally, Derrida acknowledges that unconditional hospitality is a risky venture. For unconditional hospitality to take place, you have to accept the risk of the other coming and destroying the place, initiating a revolution, uh, which sort of happened in the mustard seed, stealing everything or killing everyone. The visit may actually be very dangerous, and we must not ignore this fact. But would a hospitality without risk, a hospitality backed by certain assurances, a hospitality protected by an immune system against the wholly other, be true hospitality? When the risk involves not only oneself but others, the ethical dilemma becomes complex, even undecidable. Isn't willingness to invite even a potential murderer a form of selfish hubris too? How can the host be sure that the only subject he endangers is him or herself? How can the risk of infinite hospitality ever be self-contained? The house whose doors I open to the potential rapist may be mine, but it may be shared by others who might become victims without having been consulted about the desirability of infinite hospitality, which is when the politics of hospitality has to ask ethical questions. Um, I'll just give, I know I'm kind of running out of time. Maybe just one example of that was at St. Joseph's House. Um, we had a shelter that took in a limited number of people. But at the time that I had first moved to Rochester, there was a serial killer out who had killed a number of women. And it was at that time it was all women running the house. And one night the house got a call claiming that one of its guests was the serial killer, which, as you might imagine, caused considerable panic in the house. And um, a bunch of us, kind of volunteered to stay in the house. We decided it was not right just on the basis of one phone call to evict this person. So a bunch of us decided to stay, volunteered to stay in the house, so that it, it wouldn't just be women, and not to be sexist or anything, but having a male there maybe was a little reassuring. It turned out that this was not the guy, but that sense of risk was still there. I could tell some other stories as well. Um, in these new lectures, one of the new things that Derrida did that I hadn't picked up in earlier things was he also made a distinction between public and private hospitality, between public hospitality, the hospitality offered by the nation, or institutions connected with the nation, which basically concerns immigration, refugees, etc., and private hospitality offered by individuals, families, or small groups or networks, um, and talked a bit about how those two can come into conflict, especially a number of cases in France where individuals or families were giving shelter to illegal immigrants and, in some cases, arrested on what Derrida called the crime of hospitality. Um, but I won't get into any. There's a couple examples of that. I won't get into that anymore. Just a few conclusions, and then we can do questions if I haven't put everybody to sleep. It may not be far-fetched to say that Jacques Derrida, to apply his terminology, has been hospitable to the spirit of Dorothy Day. Followers of Derrida and of Day can benefit by exploring the work of the other. For followers of Jacques Derrida, the example of the worker provides innumerable empirical examples of concrete efforts to explore the aporia of hospitality. Pure hospitality may be an impossibility, but it is possible to come much closer to actualizing it than many assume. As G.K. Chesterton said of the Sermon on the Mount, it has not been tried and found wanting, it has been found difficult and left untried. The writings and example of Dorothy Day reveal that serious thinkers can come to amazingly similar conclusions by very different routes. For followers of Dorothy Day, Derrida's conception of hospitality, both as aporia and as contrast between conditional and unconditional, may be a useful framework or a fruitful framework for thinking about the very real problems of hospitality presented at the doors and inside of Catholic worker houses. What is at stake when one is confronted by a guest who is drunk, high, or violent? And what is at stake when one must make that undecidable decision about whether to continue to provide personalist hospitality to a guest or to insist or urge that he or she go to some form of professional therapy? For Christians in particular, the insights of Day and Derrida may prove fruitful not only for the exploration of ethics, but also for theology and Christology. Um, I'll just advance a couple of points here. I'm not a theologian, so you can take them for what they're worth. Uh, with respect to ethics, Christians would do well to take seriously Derrida's assertion that ethics is hospitality. Would it mean to conceive of ethics as openness to the other, human, God, creation? And aren't Jesus' depiction of the Last Judgment in Matthew 25 and Isaiah's description of the fast that Yahweh desires in his chapter 58 really saying that ethics is hospitality? Christians can also benefit from serious reflection on Derrida's association that all that is ethically worthwhile is aporia, contradiction, an impasse rather than a matter of successfully following rules. The Sermon on the Mount is aporia, impossible to fulfill to the letter, not a set of rules that human beings can simply obey. I really contrast like the ethic of the Sermon on the Mount to the Ten Commandments. I mean, in theory, maybe one of us could say, oh, you know, I followed all the commandments. I'm a good person. But there's nobody that could say that, oh, I followed the Sermon on the Mount to the letter with no failings. I mean, it is an aporia, it's an impossibility, and yet we're called to try. And the only way to live with these demands is with the offer of forgiveness, which is central to the message of Jesus. Jesus asks the impossible of us, but forgives our failures as long as we actually are making a serious effort. For Dorothy Day and for many Catholic workers, there is no good conscience involved in hospitality. Hospitality involves putting yourself in a situation, and oftentimes in many situations, where there's nothing you can do that can make you say, oh, I'm a good person, I did the right thing. So many times there's pain involved in any decision you make. Um, and you know, my own feeble attempts of hospitality have, if nothing else, led to some pretty deep insights into my own moral failings. The primacy of hospitality also has important theological implications. The common images invoked for God are usually images of power and control: king, doctor, lord, architect, watchmaker. But the image of God invoked in hospitality is usually that of the guest, the stranger, the powerless one, the one in need. The image of God as guest provides a crucial corrective to the other power-laden images so often invoked in Christian theology. We find God in the poor and the vulnerable. God is the one who appears to us in need, who demands a response. Christologically, I think hospitality provides a powerful lens through which to interpret the incarnation and the redemption. The incarnation is the story of becoming human, walking among us, often with no place to lay his head. Although Jesus both gave and received hospitality during his life, in the end, humans refuse hospitality, executing him on a cross. The story of God's appearing as humans, as guests, is paralleled in many ancient myths and folk tales. The Jesus story, however, has one crucial difference. In other stories, the people who refuse hospitality to the god are often punished. In the Jesus story, the refusal of hospitality is carried to the extreme of the death penalty. Most important, however, here God forgives our lack of hospitality, making this the event which leads to universal salvation. Jesus reveals our inhospitality, but offers forgiveness and a new chance to embrace the hospitality of the kingdom of God. Um, so these are just preliminary reflections since I'm simply a humble sociologist. Um, but as we explore hospitality, whether in thought or practice, we would do well to do so in a spirit of humility, keeping in mind both Derrida's conclusion that we do not understand hospitality and Day's question, where is our vaunted hospitality? And if anybody's still awake, we can do some discussion.